Today I want to talk to you about having a non-assuming faith and how we are called to be non-assuming followers of Jesus who can expect great things, but also that we might have to endure trials as well. In my life, I've come to try not to make assumptions. And for good or bad, I try to live a life where I'm a pretty non-assuming person. Take, for instance, this week. We assumed with it being spring break and all, that we could go camping. We assumed this fact to the point that we had made reservations for Thursday and Friday night in a nearby campground. So we assumed it's spring break, the weather's going to be nice, right? We'll spend some time in the woods. But then it snowed. And it snowed a lot, and then the snow stayed on the ground. And then the snow melted and the ground became muddy. And then it started sleeting. All during the time we assumed that we could be camping this week. So the first assumption I've learned not to make is I have no idea what Indiana weather is going to do. So I just assume not to. I'll just take it one day at a time. We make assumptions. I've learned not to make assumptions about people because people you thought you trusted or you thought you knew, sometimes those people will disappoint you. But also the flip side happens, that people you don't know and maybe you haven't gotten to know that well, they will come along and surprise you. So I try not to make assumptions when it comes to people until I get to know them. I find I make assumptions in my faith as well. But I try not to, because I have this experience where sometimes, or maybe more often than not, God doesn't answer the prayers that I pray. But I'm not defeated by that because I have all these other times in my life where God has answered prayers I didn't even know I was supposed to be praying. So even when I come to God in prayer, I don't assume to give God the answers or assume what answers God is going to give me. Simply accept that I know that God does answer prayer. We live our lives based on assumptions. Based on the weather is a funny one, but we all live our lives with certain assumptions. We assume that hard work brings reward. But then we're disappointed when the person who's cut corners ends up getting the job promotion instead of ourselves. We assume we can trust people, as I've shared, but sometimes people come along and they haven't been straightforward with us. I like to assume that everyone's going to be honest and straightforward with me. But I've had those times where I've just found out that person has been stabbing me in the back the whole time. We make certain assumptions when it comes to our faith as well. And maybe pastors, for good and bad, feed these assumptions. But don't we all assume if we just have enough faith, then God will reward us? If we just pray hard enough, then God will take away our sickness or not let our loved one pass away. If we just pray enough, God will come along and fill our bank accounts, right? If we just have enough faith. And if we just pray hard enough. I saw one of these pastors on Twitter, and the pastor will remain nameless, but this is the tweet that they sent out. The tweet said that if I really wanted that car, and God wanted me to have that car, then in faith I should go buy that car because God will give me the means to pay for that car. That's someone else. I am not giving you all that advice. But that's sometimes how people think or assume that Jesus works. That he's like a genie in the bottle. If we just ask him nicely, then he'll do all these great things for us. We'll have a perfect life. We'll have all that our hearts desire. That Jesus will grant our every desire and meet our every demand and make life perfect for us if we just have enough faith. But that's not what I've learned about my faith. Again, my faith teaches me to assume that great things will happen in my life, but also to assume that God will help me endure when things aren't so great. Jesus didn't say that faith in him would make life easy, just easier. On that Palm Sunday, the crowd acted based on their assumptions of who Jesus was, or who they thought Jesus was. And in order to set this story of Palm Sunday for you this morning, I have to give you a brief version of these two books that appear in some apocryphas of the Bible. I was teaching on Tuesday during my Sermon Club Bible study that you really can't understand the New Testament, or especially Palm Sunday, unless you know the story of the Maccabees. See, a little over 100 years before Jesus' own earthly ministry, before he entered Jerusalem, there was this family called the Maccabees, and they led a violent uprising against Rome. And they succeeded. And there's one passage in particular that I wanted to share with you this morning that comes from the first book of Maccabees. And it goes like this. And this is talking about Simon Maccabeus, who was the great hero of that Jewish revolt. In the book of Maccabees, we read, "They entered Jerusalem with praise and palm branches, with hymns and psalms, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel." Again, this is 100 years before Jesus. But Palm Sunday was exactly like that day, those hundreds of years before. And you see, even though that story was old, people still in Jesus' day knew that story by heart. Because you see, the Maccabean revolt, it didn't last long. And Rome ended up sweeping back into the region and became the oppressor again. And so this hope, not just of a Messiah, but the hope of the crowd, was touched off by them expecting that someone like Simon Maccabeus would come back. That someone would come with military force and conquer Rome forever. That was the assumption of these crowds. And I know this because when Jesus looked like he would be defeated on the cross, none of the crowd was there anymore. Instead, that day, they all assumed that he had come to win a great victory. And their assumptions is that he would do it like had happened in the past. But instead, they would have to learn that Jesus would win a victory. And an enemy would be defeated. And yet that enemy would not just be Rome. It would be the tyranny of sin and of death. And I like the fact that Jesus just allowed them those assumptions. That Jesus didn't stop them from saying Hosanna, which means Lord, save us. He didn't stop them from shouting about God's kingdom. Because even though they assumed one thing, or one way that their hopes would come about, Jesus knew that while he would do that, would defy their expectations, would be something they totally didn't assume. That the victory would come through suffering. That the strength and the power would come through humility. And that the tyranny that would be destroyed was no tyranny of the world, but the power of sin and death in the world. So again, it's just like our assumptions, is that we assume that Jesus saves us. We assume that he gives us hope. But sometimes we can't exactly identify how those answers come. Just like my prayers, I pray all the time. I pray for Jesus' mercy. I pray for Jesus' salvation. But again, sometimes Jesus answers those prayers exactly how I assume he will. But more often, he's answering prayers I didn't even know how to pray. We need to learn to be non-assuming followers of Jesus. We need not to treat him like a spiritual ATM machine or a genie in the bottle. We need to stop expecting Jesus to meet all of our demands and give us the perfect life. Instead, we need to assume that he will do great things in our life and also help us endure the worst. So how can you be a non-assuming follower of Jesus? How can you be a non-assuming follower? I'm going to give you 4 things if you want to write them down. Number 1, don't let the past define your present. It's great advice in any context of faith. Don't let your past define your present. The crowd that day was stuck in the past. They thought only God saved them in certain ways, like through military might. And so one of the lessons of Palm Sunday is not to let the past define your present. Just because something happened to you in the past does not automatically mean it will happen again. For instance, just because someone broke your heart in the past doesn't mean someone else will break it in your present. Just because something happened to someone else doesn't mean that that will happen to you. We look to the past to learn from our mistakes, right? But just because we make a mistake in the past, it doesn't mean that defines our present. Don't let your past define your present. Number 2, I want you all to assume that Jesus knows what lies ahead of where he sends you. Assume that Jesus knows what lies ahead of where he sends you. Jesus knows what lies ahead of where he sends you. He told the disciples that he was sending them on ahead. And he said that there would be a colt. And he said that they could untie that colt. And if someone asked them why they were untying it, all they had to say was that the Lord needs it and he'll give it right back. The colt was a loner in this story. And I imagine that the colt does make it back to the owners. But the disciples learned in this story of Palm Sunday that Jesus doesn't send you where he doesn't know what lies ahead of you. And that even right now there is a plan at work in your life. And I'm not saying that Jesus pulls all the strings and controls everything that happens. But Jesus knows what lies ahead of you before you do. And we have to assume that he wouldn't send us somewhere where he doesn't know what lies ahead of us. And he might know there's a danger or an obstacle that we might have to surmount. He also knows that he might have already placed that blessing that lies ahead of you in a situation. That Jesus knows that there's that person who's going to come along and help you at the right moment when you need them. And we're talking doctrine of providence kind of stuff. You know, this idea that God is working behind the scenes, that Jesus knows what lies ahead of where he sends us. So whatever you might fear is out there, Jesus knows it's there. And he's already setting up a way for you to overcome that fear, to overcome that challenge, or to receive the blessing that is lying ahead where he sends you. Number 3, I've already said. In our lives, we should expect great things to happen, even knowing that we must endure the worst. We expect the great, knowing that we will have the strength also to endure the worst. You know, one of the ways I often shape this is we should plan for the worst, but always hope for the best. You all live your life that way. It's a lot of the same lessons, that we can expect great things to happen. We could show up next Sunday and realize that the grave was empty, that Jesus is risen. We could live our lives between the hosannas of Palm Sundays and the he is risens of Easter Sundays. But we miss the core of the story, is that none of that praise and none of that new life comes without endurance. The story of Holy Week that we will share together is how Jesus endured, how Jesus suffered. And he willingly did so because he knew the great things that lay ahead of him for us. And so in faith, when we put our faith in Jesus, we expect to see him do some great things in our life. We also know he'll be there to endure the worst with us, because that's what he shows us so clearly in the example that he sets in his passion. Finally, let's listen to the prophet Isaiah this morning. And let's let Jesus be who he says he is and who he shows himself to be. Jesus didn't come like a cosmic avenger to defeat evil. Instead, the Bible tells us that he didn't come to strike back. He gave his back to those who would strike. Jesus didn't come to get revenge. He came to save. We have to let Jesus be powerful in his witness of humility. We have to be unlike the crowd and expect that Jesus can defy the odds, just not in the ways that we think he may. We have to let Jesus be who he is, and to quit treating him like a genie in the bottle or some cosmic avenger who will one day take us all to heaven with him. A man named Simon once entered Jerusalem while crowds waved palm branches and shouted Hosanna. He had won a great battle in the world. He had driven out Rome. But his kingdom didn't last that long. A man named Jesus entered the same way, and yet he defeated more than just an empire of this world. He undid the empire of self by giving himself over to God, so that we might live in the kingdom that he now lives. And whereas kingdoms of Maccabees, of Rome, kingdoms rise and fall, of Jesus' kingdom, the truth of the gospel is that it has no end. That the kingdom Jesus brought to rule over, that he will one day bring in full. We're talking in terms of forever kingdom. And that's the kingdom where our assumptions should come from. Our assumptions should be principled on that kingdom that Christ now rules, where a person's worth is determined by the love that God has for them, beyond race or gender or where you come from or how much do you have. A person's value should be determined simply by how much God loves them and calls us to love them as well. A principle by which what's possible is greater than anything that we might seem is probable. We think certain things are probable, but when we talk in terms of the kingdom things, we see that with God, all things are possible. We must live out that assumption in our lives. We also must live out the assumption that strength is truly shown through humility. That wealth is truly shown through generosity. That leadership is shown through service. And that the greatest power comes in sacrifice, not ruling over. That's the kingdom that Jesus fought and died for and will one day bring in full. So let us go and be non-assuming followers of Jesus. We might not know what the weather will be one day to the next here in southern Indiana, but we can trust that what Jesus says is true. He is the same, yesterday and today and forever. So let's not let the past define our present, but let us live for the possibilities of that kingdom, that world without end. Amen.